So now that we've identified the different market segments, we need to decide which ones to actually go after. This is the act of targeting. Now, there are many ways to determine which market segment to actually go after, but one of the things that's very useful in doing this is something called a perceptual map. This is often a two-dimensional representation of the marketplace, and more importantly, of consumers' perceptions of that marketplace. Doing that gives us a chance to understand if there are particular gaps in the market that we might consider filling. So as one example, we might consider the vodka marketplace. And specifically, we might want to consider vodka before the introduction of Grey Goose vodka, which is considered a super premium brand. And if we do that, we might map the consumer understanding of this environment on two distinct dimensions. On the horizontal axis, we might consider the authenticity of it. Vodka traditionally comes from a Russian heritage, and so we might want to consider if a vodka is reflective of that Russian heritage or not. And then we might want to consider something like prestige or cost on the y-axis. Of course, there are going to be expensive vodkas, and there are going to be inexpensive vodkas. And if we looked at that marketplace before the introduction of Grey Goose vodka, it might look something like this. Now, one thing that becomes evident is that vodka was considered an inexpensive alcohol. It was generally priced relatively low, and it did vary to the extent that it was considered authentic and not. But what seems obvious, in hindsight at least, is that this leaves a gap in the marketplace, specifically towards the top of this graph, a place where consumers don't see any products at the moment. And so Grey Goose, when they introduced their product, took advantage of this and positioned themselves as an expensive, high-end premium vodka with very little regard to how authentic it actually was. And shortly after Grey Goose, of course, there were many copycats that came along, because they saw that the market opportunity exists to actually capitalize on this new ultra-premium market. So we saw brands like Sky and brands like Belvedere coming in and selling high-end vodkas as well, because they realized that there's an opportunity here. They saw a market segment that they can go after. Expensive vodka for people who want to consume vodka as a prestige product, as opposed to just something that'll, well, for lack of a better term, get it done. And so if we fast forward even more, we see more and more of this going on. We see vodkas that are spanning the authenticity spectrum all the way from Grey Goose, which doesn't particularly have a Russian heritage, to brands like Elite, which does, and even more so to brands like Jewel of Russia, which is a $180 per bottle vodka. It is a super premium bottle that has an authentic Russian component and is considered premium and high-end. And so now we see how this particular strategy of visualizing what consumers perceive can allow us to fill market gaps and choose which market segments to actually go after. Now, of course, this is just one example in the vodka space, but the same general strategy can be applied to any industry. Once you understand how consumers perceive an environment, you can understand which particular market segments to actively go after. And now you might want to ask yourself, well, how do you actually make that determination? And so there's three main components that can be used to decide which markets to actually go after. The first is the market opportunity for profit. How big is the market segment? How much is it growing? And is there room to actually make money in that space? We saw that in the carpet fiber example and certainly in the vodka example a moment ago. The second is the competitive intensity. If you were Grey Goose considering entering the market today, it would be a very different story because there's a lot of different high premium vodkas out there already. It's very competitive, and so entering that space would be difficult. Of course, on the other hand, if you're Grey Goose when they actually launched, there was nobody there. The competitive environment was very open, and they can come in and take advantage of that space. And lastly, we of course need to consider if entering a particular target market makes sense given the company's fit. Does that market line up with the objectives of the company, the competencies of the company, the existing customer base? Will they revolt if they see a product entering in that space or not? And of course, with the resources available to actually execute on any strategy in that particular market. If all three of these general categories are satisfied, only then is target market selection appropriate. And even once we actually select a target market, we then have to decide how to position our product for consumers to perceive us in that particular space. And that is the topic of our next video.